Hi there, my name is Dr. Freya Cox-Jensen and I'm a senior lecturer in history here at the University of Exeter. I want to talk to you today about the relationship between history and the world in which we live. So I work in a field loosely called reception studies. This is about the way that particular parts of history are received, so understood, interpreted and used by people at later points in time. And this kind of approach to history, looking at how the past is applied to later presents, reinforces three key messages that lie at the heart of our discipline. So firstly, history really matters. It matters to all sorts of people, in all sorts of ways, and for all sorts of reasons. Secondly, history is everywhere. Pretty much anywhere you go in the world today, you will see the past somewhere around you. And thirdly, the idea that there is no one true history. History is always open to interpretation, and this is why historians argue, that's why they disagree. And this means that there is an inherent power in the past. It can be used and deployed by different people at different times for all sorts of different purposes. There are obvious political ways in which this can be done. I'm going to steer clear of those today. Instead, I want to talk to you about culture, broadly conceived. And I want to look at some examples of the way that the past is used in British society, both today and the way that that's been done in previous centuries. So we're going to start off with some places that we see the past operating in daily life and culture. Places that we sometimes might not even be aware of, even though it's happening. So I'm going to start with a couple of items from my wardrobe, bought on the high street from new in the last couple of years. First off, we have a blouse, a lady's silk shirt. And this is using the Victorian and the Edwardian past. It's very, very classically styled to match what women would have worn back then. There's a high neck. You've got these puffed sleeves narrowing down into a very narrow cuff called leg of mutton sleeves. And this would have been tucked in the olden days, in the Victorian days, into a high-waisted skirt. I bought this a few months ago. So this is somehow invoking something about the Victorian and the Edwardian past in the modern world. Second item, pair of shoes. Bought 3 or 4 years ago. These are channeling the 1920s. They're the sorts of shoes that you see in early films, that you see in postcards. Very classically, this shape of the heel, and then the little strap across the front. Also worn by modern ballroom dancers, those of you who watch Strictly. So again, a modern shoe made to look like something from the 1920s. And at the other end of the historical spectrum, we have some gladiator sandals. Sandals that are evoking a Greek or a Roman past, centuries and centuries of ancient history, with these straps that go up the legs and the cuff around the ankle. Why? What's going on here? Why are we using the past in fashion? It's a difficult question to answer, and historians will probably give you several different answers to that. Essentially, the reasons that designers from the high fashion houses choose to use particular styles, it's nebulous. It's trying to express something about the past, some kind of notion of femininity, perhaps, in the case of the Victorian blouse, maybe something to do with power and assertiveness in the case of the gladiator sandal. In all these cases, what's less important is exactly what past is being used, and what's more important is what that tells us about the present that is doing these things to the past. So it builds on something in the zeitgeist, in the current era, that certain people want to express, in this case, because they think it's going to help them to make money. This takes me to another example. On the slide, you can see some original Ladybird books. And I don't know how many of you looked at these at primary school or maybe at play school. If you didn't, then maybe ask someone from a slightly older generation, because I certainly looked at these, and I know that even my parents used them when they were very young children. These are really iconic to anybody who was alive in England and went through the education system at a particular point in time. And then in 2015, we get the updated version for adults. For example, the Ladybird book, not of shopping with mother, but of the husband, or of dating. These are satirical works. They're for grown-ups, they're funny, they tell jokes. They lightly mock the original, and certainly mock the world in which we live today. Why? Why was that done? Why was that used as a way to try and make money, using something really retro in feel, updating it with the content, but keeping the look the same? I think it draws on people's personal past. The fact that these books were ubiquitous. Pretty much everyone in England would have come into contact with them. It's a kind of nostalgia industry. It's using the past to make money from people because that past speaks to them and they will pay for it. So we've seen a couple of instances where the past is used for commercial gain, but it's not all about making money. This is a picture of a late medieval or early modern house. It's got a glorious wildflower meadow in front of it, surely the epitome of what we mean when we say Old England. This is a house called Great Dixter in East Sussex. It's a collection of buildings that now stand on a site, but they weren't there originally. They were moved from other places in the surrounding area, around about the beginning of the 20th century. The house also has a very famous garden, very, very carefully looked after. This is by no means a natural wildflower meadow. It's been planted to look like that. So what we've got here is sort of Old England, but it's also an idealised version of Old England. It's constructed much, much later for the purposes of that later age by people who wanted to capture something of that spirit of the good old days and use it in their present. So we do that today. They did it at the start of the 20th century, but it's not just the modern period that does nostalgia either, or that uses the past to make particular points. I spend a lot of time working on the early modern period. That's the 16th and the 17th century. We see exactly the same sort of thing happening there. The past being used in a nostalgic way in order to serve some particular purpose in the present. One place we can see that happening a lot is in popular songs of the period. There is a broad shared cultural trope of nostalgia happening that sees the past as a lot better than the present. I'm going to share with you one particular song. It's entitled A Description of Old England, and it dates from sometime in the later 1670s. It's probably the best example of this nostalgia for an ideal golden age, expressed through the form of a popular protest song. So it has the subtitle, A True Declaration of the Times, and it says, "The times are harder than ere they were known." It goes to the tune of Greensleeves. Old England was once a stately, brave place where trafficking everywhere went on apace. And trafficking means commerce or trade. But now trading is dead and money's grown scarce, then is not old England grown new? Where is all the treasure that in England did flow, that rich men and poor men did make a brave show? The times they now harder and harder do grow, then is not old England grown new? And it goes on like this for about 20 or 30 verses, rehearsing all the ways in which Old England was better than modern England. It's making a comparison between an idealised and really slightly fictionalised, highly selective, non-specific golden age in the past and the present of the 1670s. And the song is seeking to portray that present as a really hard time indeed, and it's calling for political and economic change and improvement. So there's an example from the 17th century. And when we look at the 17th century and the 18th century, even into the 19th century, we see that one of the specific examples of a golden past that is often held up as a mirror for the present is that of Elizabethan England. So here is Queen Elizabeth, but why? Why is it Elizabethan England that is used in subsequent centuries as a golden age? After all, anyone with a relatively robust knowledge of history of this period knows that it wasn't all that great all the time. There was a lot of religious tension, there was a lot of political uncertainty, fluctuating economics happening all the time as well, not to mention the constant fear of religious war that was happening on the continent of Europe. And the answer lies in the bits of the Elizabethan past that people chose to focus on and what they chose to ignore in order to serve their later purposes. So the picture you see is of Elizabeth I, the Tudor queen who reigned from 1558 until 1603. Throughout her reign, and crucially in the decades immediately after it, she came to embody a very English kind of Protestantism. She acted as a symbol for what we might call a sense of elective nationhood. So England being God's chosen land, the English being God's chosen people. And we see ideas of Elizabeth I and of Elizabethan Englishness being this sort of ideal that plays a really important role in the construction of a national identity from the later 17th century onwards, as a succession of less than wholly Protestant monarchs sat on the throne, less than wholly English monarchs sat on the throne, and they were challenged by a series of pretenders and potential invaders. We can see a little bit of this invasion threat even in this portrait. This is the episode of the Spanish Armada in 1588. You can see it being depicted in the background of this picture here, the ships just sailing towards England. It's known as the Armada portrait. So this is a time when the English fleet, with a little bit of help from the weather, repelled an invasion attempt by Philip II of Spain. To the people at the time, it seemed as if God was on the English side, on the side of Queen Elizabeth, helping them to victory over their enemy. And this became an extremely significant idea, a significant moment to which people would return over and over again over the course of the next few centuries. And we see this cultural memory of the Elizabethan past as a triumphant one with God on their side, being constructed and deployed at particular moments when England is under threat. England is this island nation. It's chosen by God, standing strong in the face of often Catholic threats from abroad. We see this resonance particularly strongly in the later 18th and the early 19th century, for example. We see the 1588 Armada being harnessed for patriotic ends in popular songs written when England was at war with the French, Napoleon's France. And the message was one that was really being designed to raise morale. Because if England could beat the Spanish Armada in 1588, it could certainly do the same thing now to Napoleon. That's what the people making these songs were trying to get across. So on the screen here, we've got the golden days of good Queen Bess. Queen Bess being a colloquial term for Queen Elizabeth. And the second verse is the really important one here. Oh, the golden days of good Queen Bess. Merry be the memory of good Queen Bess. Then we laughed at the bugbears of dons and armadas with their gunpowder puffs and their blustering bravado. For we knew how to manage both the musket and the bow, sir, and could bring down a Spaniard just as easy as a crow, sir. So a really explicit connection being made between an episode in the Elizabethan past that stood as an emblem of idealised Englishness and a present conflict when it was in everybody's interests to believe that England could win like this again. It's a blatant, selective manipulation of the past for a political gain in the present. So Elizabethan England, great example for people to use in later ages. And I would invite you all to think about whether or not we're still doing that today. Do we still live with this legacy of Tudorism that means something particular to us now? Does it get used for similar sorts of purposes? Perhaps not so much the Armada specifically. That doesn't fit so much with the political messages that are popular today. But Tudorism, the idea that the Tudor age was great, is that something that we're still living with? I would suggest that maybe it is. You only need to think in recent years about the number of novels that have appeared based on Tudor subjects. I've got one from my childhood by Rosemary Sutcliffe, set in a relatively non-specific Tudor past, the Armourer's House, but far more famously recently, things like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, the trilogy, or the novels of Philippa Gregory, for example. These are really, really popular examples of the Tudor past being used to speak to people in the present, because it's an age that captures the popular imagination. We can see it on screen too. I'm sure you have watched, or at least heard about, numerous films about Elizabeth, the Tudors, Henry VIII. Films come and go, television series come and go. The Tudors have a perennial appeal to people in the present, and they make an awful lot of money for the film and television industry. So, I suppose what I would like you to do is think about next time you're out and about, or think when someone says to you that history isn't as useful a subject as a science subject, for example. I'd say take a look around you. Take note of all the places that you can see history, from the everyday, the mundane, the clothes that people are wearing, to the way that it's used in political campaigns. For example, the Brexit referendum or the Scottish independence referendum. And I would say that history is all around us, influencing life everywhere we look. And that's why we need historians in our societies. Because everybody's using history, so we need experts to help us interpret the past properly. From politics to social justice to the television you watch and the clothes that you wear, history is there somewhere. And history really matters. Thank you.